All right, everyone, settle in for tonight's exploration. We're veering off the well-trodden path of heroic sagas and stepping into something a touch more unvarnished. Prepare for a deep dive, not into the glittering treasures of Spanish galleons or the exploits of conquistadors, but into the agonizing, disease-ridden, and crushingly short existence of an indigenous Mita laborer in the silver mines of Potosi within the Viceroyalty of Peru, now Bolivia, during the 17th century. That legendary silver mountain, the Cerro Rico, that poured wealth into the Spanish Empire, while the unvarnished truth for the countless thousands forced to toil within its dark toxic belly was a living hell, a death sentence meted out in daily installments of brutal labor and inescapable suffering, and frankly, your modern notions of workplace safety and human rights would seem a universe away. So, find your coziest spot. If you appreciate a journey into the raw, unfiltered past, a like on the video would be fantastic, and do consider subscribing for more of these historical reality checks. As always, I'm curious to know where you're joining us from tonight. Drop a comment with your location and time. It's always a highlight seeing our global community. Okay, perhaps dim those lights, let a soft ambient sound fill the room, and let's embark on tonight's rather sobering journey together. Your life, once rooted in the agricultural rhythms of your Andean village, the Alu, is violently uprooted by the summons of the meat. This colonial revival of an ancient Inca system of rotational labor has been twisted into a monstrous machine, feeding the Spanish crown's insatiable hunger for silver. You, a healthy male between 18 and 50, are chosen by lottery, or by the decree of your local curaca, now subservient to Spanish officials, to make the arduous journey to Potosi, the imperial villa, a city built on a mountain of silver and an ocean of indigenous tears. Leaving your family, your fields, your way of life, feels like a kind of death in itself. The journey to Potosi is an ordeal. You travel for weeks, perhaps months, across rugged mountain terrain, often with your family accompanying you into this uncertain future, carrying meager provision. The altitude alone is a torment. Potosi sits at over 13,000 feet, an oxygen-starved environment that leaves you breathless, weak, and prone to soroshi, mountain sickness, with its splitting headaches and nausea. Many do not even survive the journey, succumbing to exhaustion, hunger, or disease along the desolate mountain paths. Upon arrival, the sight of Potosi is overwhelming. A chaotic, bustling city, one of the largest in the world at its peak, built at the foot of the Cerro Rico, the rich mountain, its slopes scarred with countless mine entrances and tailings heaps. The air is thin, cold, and often filled with the acrid smoke from smelting operations. You are assigned to a Parroquia de Indios, a segregated native quarter, where you live in a cramped, squalid adobe hut, offering little protection from the biting Andean winds and freezing nights. Sanitation is non-existent, disease is rampant. Your Mita service means you are now part of a vast, unceasing machine of silver extraction. You are assigned to a mine owner, an azoguero, who often sees you not as a human being but as an expendable unit of labor. The work is divided into shifts, often 12 hours long, day and night, ensuring the mines never fall silent. For 1 week out of 3 you might be forced to remain inside the mine continuously, a living entombment. The other 2 weeks you might perform surface labor or desperately try to earn enough to survive, as your Mita wage is pitifully small, often insufficient even to buy food. Descending into the Cerro Rico is like entering the underworld. The mine shafts are narrow, dark, and terrifyingly deep, often just crude tunnels spiraling down into the mountain's guts. You carry a tallow candle, its flickering flame your only light, casting long, dancing shadows that play tricks on your exhausted mind. The air grows heavy, thick with dust, the smell of damp rock, human sweat, and the metallic tang of minerals. The silence is broken only by the drip of water, the distant clang of hammers, and your own ragged breathing. The work itself is unimaginably brutal. As a burritero, you might spend your shift in a cramped, unventilated stope, swinging a heavy iron bar or hammer to break the silver ore from the rock face. The dust you inhale is thick with silica, arsenic, and other toxic minerals, slowly destroying your lungs. Or you might be an apiri, a carrier, tasked with hauling impossibly heavy loads of ore, often over 100 pounds, up rickety ladders made of notched logs or twisted leather straps, through narrow, winding passages, for thousands of feet to the surface. A single misstep means a fatal fall. The ladders, often called chicken ladders, are death traps. Wet with seepage, worn smooth by countless feet, they offer a precarious ascent. You climb in near total darkness, the weight of the ore sack cutting into your back and shoulders, your muscles screaming, your lungs burning from the altitude and dust. The bodies of those who have fallen are a common, gruesome sight at the bottom of shafts, a stark reminder of your own constant peril. Fear is your constant companion, but exhaustion often dulls even that. Cave-ins are an ever-present threat. The mountain is a honeycomb of tunnels, shoddily constructed and poorly supported. The ground shudders from distant blasting, or the timbers groan a warning, but often there is no warning at all. Tons of rock can collapse in an instant, burying work gangs alive. The screams are quickly muffled. Rescue attempts are rare and usually futile. You simply become another ghost haunting the Cerro Rico. The use of mercury in the amalgamation process to extract silver, introduced in the late 16th century, adds another layer of horror. You might be forced to work in the ingenios, the ore processing mills, treading crushed ore mixed with mercury with your bare feet, or tending the hot, fume-filled ovens where the mercury is vaporized. Mercury poisoning leads to tremors, loosened teeth, kidney failure, madness, and a slow, agonizing death. The Spanish call it the azogados dance. Your diet in Potosi is meager and inadequate for the brutal labor you perform. Coca leaves, chewed constantly, help to numb the hunger, the cold and the exhaustion, allowing you to work beyond your body's natural limits. But they offer no real nourishment. You might subsist on a little freeze-dried potato, chuño, some maize, and perhaps occasionally some llama meat. Malnutrition weakens your resistance to disease, and your body wastes away. The Spanish overseers, the mayordomos or capataces, rule through fear and violence. While direct depictions of extreme brutality are to be avoided in this telling, the atmosphere of constant threat is undeniable. Failure to meet quotas, a moment of rest, any sign of defiance, can result in harsh punishment. Their power is absolute, your life of little value in their eyes. The system is designed to extract the maximum labor before you are consumed. Accidents are horrifically common. Beyond cave-ins and falls, there are injuries from blasting, from tools slipping, from the sheer physical strain. Broken limbs, crushed hands, eye injuries, these are part of the daily reality. Medical care is virtually non-existent for meta labor. An injury that prevents you from working is often a death sentence, as you can no longer earn even the pittance required for food. The silver extracted at such enormous human cost fuels the Spanish Empire, funding its wars, its art, its aristocracy. Potosi becomes a byword for incredible wealth. But for you, the indigenous laborer, it is a place of death, a mouth of hell, that consumes men by the thousand. The saying goes that the silver extracted from Potosi could build a bridge of silver from the mountain to Spain, and a bridge of bones back with the bodies of those who died mining it. Your family, if they accompanied you to Potosi, shares in your suffering. Your wife might work in the ingenios, sifting ore, or try to sell trinkets or food in the chaotic markets to supplement your meager earnings. Your children, if they survive the harsh conditions and rampant diseases, might be forced to work from a young age, perhaps carrying tools or sorting ore, their childhoods sacrificed to the mountain of silver. The family unit, the bedrock of Andean society, is shattered by the meat. The high altitude of Potosi means the nights are bitterly cold. Your adobe hut offers little warmth. You huddle with your family under thin, ragged blankets, trying to conserve body heat. Fuel for fires is scarce and expensive. The cold seeps into your bones, exacerbating the aches and pains from your daily labor, making sleep a fitful, shivering affair. Disease thrives in the overcrowded, unsanitary conditions of the native quarters in the mine. Respiratory infections, mal de la mina, or miner's lung, are almost universal due to the dust. Typhus, dysentery and smallpox sweep through the population. The combination of overwork, malnutrition, cold and lack of hygiene creates a perfect storm for epidemics that decimate the meta workforce. The meta system is designed to be a rotating draft, with laborers serving for a period and then theoretically returning to their villages. But the mortality rate is so high, and the debt peonage so effective, many are forced to stay on to work off debts incurred for food or supplies from company stores, that for many, Potosi becomes a one-way journey. Few who enter the mines for their meta service emerge healthy, or even alive. The cultural and spiritual devastation is as profound as the physical. You are torn from your sacred lands, your ancestral traditions, your communal way of life. The Spanish priests attempt to convert you to Christianity, often forcibly, but your indigenous beliefs, your reverence for the Pachamama, Mother Earth, are hard to extinguish, even as you toil to disembowel her for her silver. This spiritual conflict adds another layer to your torment. The sheer scale of the mining operations is staggering. The Cerro Rico is riddled with thousands of tunnels, a vast, dark labyrinth, extending deep into the earth. The noise of the ingenios, the stamping mills crushing the ore, is a constant, deafening roar that fills the valley. The landscape around Potosi is barren, stripped of trees for timber and fuel, polluted by mine tailings and mercury fumes. It is an environment transformed by greed into a vision of industrial hell. There is little concept of safety. Mine shafts are unlit beyond your own ken. Ventilation is minimal, the air thick with explosive gases and choking dust. There are no safety regulations, no inspections, no concern for the well-being of the indigenous workforce. You are cheaper than a candle, more expendable than a mule. Your life is measured only by the amount of silver you can help extract before you die. The contrast between the abject poverty of the Mita laborers and the ostentatious wealth of the Spanish mine owners and officials is grotesque. While you shiver in a squalid hut and starve on meager rations, they live in grand houses, dress in fine silks, and feast at lavish banquets, their fortunes built upon your broken body and stolen life. This glaring injustice is the foundation of the colonial order. Escape is almost impossible. The surrounding terrain is harsh and unforgiving. The Spanish authorities and mine owners employ guards and overseers to prevent flight. If caught attempting to escape, the punishment would be severe, a terrifying example to others. You are trapped, geographically and economically, in this mountain of death. The only brief respite from the crushing labor and despair might come from chewing coca leaves, which provide a temporary numbing of hunger, cold and fatigue, and perhaps a fleeting sense of detachment, or from the occasional religious festival, where traditional Indian music and dance might offer a moment of communal solace, a fragile connection to a lost world. But these are mere flickers of light in an overwhelming darkness. The sound of the pickaxe striking rock, the rhythmic thud of your own heart in the thin air, the distant groans of other laborers, the creak of the ore sacks on your back, these are the persistent sounds of your existence. They are a soundtrack to your slow demise, a daily reminder of your servitude in the bowels of the earth. The hierarchy within the mine is clear. Spanish and Creole overseers direct the work, often with brutal impatience. Mestizo foremen might act as intermediaries. But at the bottom are you and your fellow indigenous laborers, the human fuel for this vast silver-producing machine. There is no upward mobility, only the slow descent into exhaustion and death. The constant inhalation of stone dust, laden with silica, causes silicosis, a progressive and irreversible lung disease. Your breathing becomes labored, your chest tight, a persistent cough racks your body. You see older though still young by other standards, miners wasting away, gasping for every breath, their lives literally choked out of them by the mountain's dust. This is your likely future, if you survive the other dangers. The psychological toll of this existence is the constant fear, the unrelenting physical hardship, the loss of freedom and dignity, the witnessing of so much death and suffering. It grinds down the human spirit. Apathy, despair, or a quiet simmering rage might become your constant companion. Many lose the will to live in this man-made inferno. The Spanish colonial administration, while sometimes issuing regulations ostensibly to protect indigenous laborers, rarely enforces them effectively. The greed for silver, the power of the mine owners, and the vast distances involved, mean that such laws are often dead letters. The reality on the ground in Potosi is one of unchecked exploitation and brutality. The mercury poisoning from the amalgamation process is insidious. The fumes you inhale while tending the ovens, the mercury you absorb through your skin while treading the ore, it attacks your nervous system. You might develop uncontrollable tremors, the quicksilver shuffle, slurred speech, and eventually madness. It is a horrific invisible killer, adding another layer of terror to the ingenios. The women of Potosi, the wives and daughters of the Mita laborers, face their own set of hardship. They struggle to feed their families, care for the sick and injured, and endure the constant anxiety of knowing their menfolk are risking their lives daily in the mines. Many are widowed young, left to fend for themselves and their children in a harsh and unforgiving environment. Their suffering is an integral part of Potosi's tragic story. The concept of a day off is largely meaningless. Even when not assigned to the Mita shifts in the mine, you might be forced to perform other labor for the mine owner, or desperately try to cultivate a tiny plot of barren land, or scavenge for food or fuel. Rest is a luxury you can rarely afford if you and your family are to survive even another week. The religious syncretism you might practice, blending your ancestral Andean deities with the imposed Catholic saints, is a quiet form of cultural resistance, a way to maintain a connection to your identity in the face of overwhelming oppression. You might offer prayers to both the Virgin Mary and the Pachamama, seeking solace and protection from all available spiritual sources. The Cerro Rico itself becomes a malevolent deity in your mind, a mountain that eats men. Its gaping mine shafts are its hungry mouths, its silver veins the glittering lure that draws men to their doom. You fear it, you hate it, yet your life is inextricably bound to it. It is the source of your torment and your family's precarious survival. The sheer number of deaths is staggering. Historians estimate that millions of indigenous people perished in the Potosi mines over the centuries of Spanish colonial rule, from accidents, disease, exhaustion, and mercury poisoning. The mountain is a vast unmarked graveyard, its silver tinged with the blood and tears of generations.
The few who survive their term of mita service and manage to return to their villages are often broken men, their health shattered, their spirits crushed. They bring back little more than scars, diseases and harrowing memory. They are a living testament to the horrors of Potosi, a warning to those whose turn may yet come. Their homecoming is often more a funeral than a celebration. The silver from Potosi flows across the Atlantic, enriching the Spanish crown, fueling European economies, and financing global trade. But this river of silver has its source in a torrent of human suffering, a hidden history of exploitation and death that is rarely acknowledged in the grand narratives of empire and commerce. You are one of the forgotten sources of that wealth. The tools you use are primitive and often in poor repair: an iron-tipped wooden crowbar, a heavy stone hammer, a woven sack for carrying ore. These are your weapons in the daily battle against the unyielding rock. They become extensions of your aching limbs, symbols of your unending, back-breaking labor. The darkness of the mine is absolute, broken only by the feeble flicker of your tallow candle. This dim light casts monstrous dancing shadows on the tunnel walls, playing tricks on your exhausted eye. The fear of your candle extinguishing, plunging you into total terrifying blackness, is a constant anxiety. Your candle is your fragile link to the world of sight, and to life itself. The air in the deeper levels of the mine is often foul and oxygen depleted. You gasp for breath, your lungs burning, your head swimming. The only ventilation comes from crude shafts or the occasional forced draft, insufficient for the number of men working and the gases released by blasting and decomposing matter. Suffocation is a real and present danger. The social life in the mita laborers' quarters is one of shared misery. Men from different regions, speaking different dialects, are thrown together in squalor. There might be moments of camaraderie, shared songs or stories from their distant homes, but also tension, suspicion, and despair. The common bond is suffering and a yearning for an escape that rarely comes. The constant dampness in many parts of the mine, from seepage and underground springs, makes the work even more miserable. Your clothes are perpetually wet, chilling you to the bone. The rocks are slippery, increasing the risk of falls. The dampness breeds fungal infections and exacerbates respiratory ailments. It is another relentless enemy in your subterranean world. The overseers often use a system of quotas, demanding a certain amount of ore from each worker or failure to meet these quotas can result in beatings, a withholding of your already meager wage, or other punishments. This drives you to work beyond your limits, to take risks, to sacrifice your health and safety for a few more pounds of silver-bearing rock. The coca leaf, while providing a temporary illusion of strength and endurance, also takes its toll. It dulls the appetite, leading to further malnutrition. It can mask the symptoms of exhaustion and illness, causing you to push your body to its breaking point. It is a crutch that ultimately weakens you, another tool in the system of your exploitation. The brief moments when you emerge from the mine into the daylight are a shock to the system. The sun blinds you, the thin air feels almost fresh by comparison, but this respite is short-lived. You deliver your load of ore, perhaps receive a token for your labor, and then prepare for your next descent into the darkness, or collapse in exhaustion in your squalid hut. The only real escape from Potosi for most mita laborers is death, whether from accident, disease, or simply the cumulative effect of years of brutal overwork and deprivation. Your life expectancy is tragically short. The Cerro Rico is a voracious consumer of human lives, its silver extracted at an almost unimaginable cost in indigenous suffering. Your story is one of millions, a testament to the brutal heart of colonial greed.
In the middle of the 19th century, the United States was a nation of two mines, a country of continental size that existed as two separate worlds. The East was a place of burgeoning cities, established industry, and dense networks of canals and railways. The West, particularly the new state of California, separated by 2,000 miles of formidable terrain, was a land of gold and promise. But it might as well have been on another continent. To travel between them was an epic undertaking, a journey of many months by sea around the treacherous Cape Horn, or a perilous overland trek by wagon train across vast plains, waterless deserts, and towering mountain ranges. The dream of binding these two halves together, of lashing the continent with rails of iron, was a powerful national obsession, but it was a dream deferred, paralyzed by the bitter sectional rivalries between the North and the South, who could not agree on a route. Then came the Civil War. As the nation tore itself apart, an act of monumental forward-looking ambition took place. With the southern states seceded from the Union, the political deadlock was broken. In 1862, even as the outcome of the great conflict was far from certain, President Abraham Lincoln signed the Pacific Railway Act. It was a declaration of faith in the future of the Union. The act called for the creation of two companies that would engage in a great race, a construction project on a scale never before attempted. One would build west from the Missouri River, the other east from California. They would race towards each other across the wilderness, and the point where they met would mark the unification of the continent. The nation, in its darkest hour, committed itself to its most audacious dream. The company tasked with building west from Omaha, Nebraska, was the Union Pacific. Its challenge was one of sheer scale and logistics. It had to lay track across the vast, featureless expanse of the Great Plains, a landscape that promised brutal winters, scorching summers, and a profound, soul-crushing emptiness. The primary force behind the Union Pacific was not an engineer but a doctor-turned-financier, the brilliant, cunning, and deeply corrupt Thomas Durant. Durant was a master manipulator of stocks and contracts. He saw the railroad less as a transportation artery and more as a machine for generating government subsidies and personal wealth. The government was offering huge land grants and financial bonds for every mile of track laid, and Durant's main objective was to lay as many miles as possible, even if it meant building winding, inefficient lines to maximize the payout. The men who did the actual work for the Union Pacific were a rough and hardened legion. They were primarily Irish immigrants, men who had fled the famine in their homeland, alongside thousands of demobilized veterans from both the Union and Confederate armies, eager for work after the war. They were a brawling, hard-drinking, and incredibly tough workforce. Their labor was punishing, a relentless cycle of grading the land, hauling the heavy wooden ties, and then laying the iron rails, each weighing over 500 pounds. The final act was the rhythmic clang of the spike mauls, the music of the track, as 10 spikes were driven home for each rail. Following the end of track was a mobile city of sin and desperation, the infamous Hell on Wheels. At the end of a hard day's work, the men would pour into these ramshackle collections of canvas tents and crude shacks, filled with saloons, gambling dens and brothels. These towns were violent, chaotic places, a testament to the brutalizing nature of the work and the isolation of the frontier. Overseeing the monumental task of construction was the chief engineer, Grenville Dodge, a former Union general. Dodge was a relentless driver of men, a man who understood logistics and motivation. His job was a constant battle, not only against the elements and the vast distances, but also against the meddling and financial schemes of his boss, Thomas Durant. As the Union Pacific pushed further west, it entered the hunting grounds of the Great Plains tribes, the Sioux, Cheyenne and Arapaho. For these people, the railroad was not a symbol of progress, it was an iron serpent, despoiling their sacred land. It heralded the end of their way of life, frightening away the vast herds of bison that were the foundation of their existence. The survey crews and grading parties came under attack. The work was now done with rifles stacked and ready, and the construction crews became an army on the move, a stark illustration of the violent collision of two worlds. While the Union Pacific battled the vastness of the plains, the second company, the Central Pacific, faced a challenge that was not one of distance, but of verticality. Starting from Sacramento, California, their route east was immediately blocked by what seemed an impassable barrier, the Sierra Nevada mountains. This was a wall of granite that rose 10,000 feet into the sky, a place of deep snows and treacherous gorges. The men behind the Central Pacific were 4 Sacramento merchants, later known as the Big Four: Leland Stanford, the grocer who would become governor, Collis Huntington and Mark Hopkins, the hardware store owners, and Charles Crocker, the dry goods merchant who would oversee construction. They were men of immense ambition, but they were not railroaders, and they were perpetually short of money. Their greatest initial problem was labor. Building in the mountains was terrifyingly difficult and dangerous work. White laborers, lured by the promise of striking it rich in the nearby silver mines of Nevada, were unreliable, often working for a short time before disappearing. The project was on the verge of failure. In desperation, Charles Crocker proposed a controversial solution: hire Chinese work. The idea was met with scorn and prejudice. The Chinese who had come to California during the gold rush were seen as small, weak, and unsuitable for such heavy labor. But Crocker persisted. He argued that the people who built the Great Wall of China could surely build a railroad. A small crew was hired on a trial basis. The result was astonishing. The Chinese laborers proved to be tireless, disciplined, and incredibly efficient. They worked from sunup to sundown, 6 days a week. They drank tea instead of whiskey, saved their money, and rarely brawled. They were in every respect a construction boss's dream. Soon the Central Pacific was actively recruiting thousands of men directly from China. This legion of Chinese workers became the backbone of the entire enterprise. It was they who would conquer the mountain. Their work was some of the most difficult and dangerous in the history of engineering. The primary obstacle was solid granite. They would spend their days suspended in woven baskets, lowered from the tops of cliffs, hand drilling holes into the rock face with a hammer and chisel. A man would hold the drill bit while one or two others would strike it in a steady rhythm. Once the hole was deep enough, it would be packed with blasting powder, the fuse lit, and the men hauled up the cliff face as quickly as possible, praying they would be out of the way before the explosion. The work was slow and perilous. Progress was sometimes measured in inches per day. In the high peaks, they faced winter snows that drifted up to 60 feet deep. They lived and worked in a network of tunnels, dug beneath the snowpack, sometimes not seeing the sun for months. Avalanches were a constant threat, sweeping away entire work camps without a trace. The company began to use the new, more powerful and far more unstable explosive, nitroglycerin. The Chinese workers, with their expertise in fireworks and gunpowder, became skilled at handling this dangerous substance. They carved 15 tunnels through the High Sierra, a monumental feat of human endurance and courage. For all their contribution, they were paid less than the white workers, and their role in this great national achievement would be largely ignored by history for more than a century. By 1867, the Central Pacific had finally broken through the mountains and descended into the high desert of the Great Basin. The Union Pacific, meanwhile, had conquered the Rockies. The nature of the work changed. It was no longer a battle against geology. It was a frantic race for profit. With both companies now on relatively flat ground, speed became the only thing that mattered. The rivalry became intense, the construction crews pushing themselves to the limit. The Union Pacific's Irish crews set a record, laying 6 miles of track in a single day. Not to be outdone, Charles Crocker of the Central Pacific wagered $10,000 that his Chinese crews could lay 10 miles in a day. On April 28, 1869, the legendary event took place. A team of 8 Irish rail handlers and thousands of Chinese workers set out at dawn. It was a perfectly choreographed performance of human strength and efficiency. The men worked with a fluid, relentless rhythm, handling 25,000 wooden ties and over 3,500 iron rails. In just under 12 hours, they had laid 10 miles and 56 feet of new track, a record that has never been broken. The two lines were now converging in Utah. Their grading crews, working far ahead of the track layers, actually passed each other, grading over 200 miles of parallel lines before the government finally stepped in and declared a meeting point. The chosen location was a desolate, sagebrush-covered basin in the middle of nowhere, Promontory Summit. On May 10, 1869, the final ceremony took place. The two great locomotives, the Union Pacific's Linnan team and the Central Pacific's Jupiter, were brought nose to nose on the final gap in the track. A crowd of dignitaries, railroad officials and workers gathered to witness the moment. A special railroad tie of polished California laurel was laid, and 4 ceremonial spikes were presented, 2 of gold, 1 of silver, and 1 a blend of gold, silver, and iron. Leland Stanford of the Central Pacific and Thomas Durant of the Union Pacific were given silver hammers to tap the final golden spike into a pre-drilled hole. A telegraph wire was attached to the spike and the hammer, so that the entire nation could hear the final blows. The message was ready to be sent to every major city in the country. Stanford swung and missed. Durant swung and also missed. It was a slightly farcical end to an epic endeavor, but it did not matter. The telegraph operator sent the message anyway. A single word flashed from coast to coast. Done. The nation erupted in celebration. Cannons fired, bells rang, and parades filled the streets. The continent was now connected. A journey that had once taken 6 months could now be completed in a single. The railroad transformed the American West, accelerating settlement, creating new towns and cities, and opening the vast resources of the interior to the industrial East. But this triumph of national will and engineering genius had a darker side. The project was rife with corruption, most famously the Credit Mobilier scandal, in which Union Pacific insiders had created a fake construction company to skim millions in fraudulent profits. The lives of the workers, particularly the Chinese, were treated as expendable, and the impact on the Native American tribes of the Great Plains was catastrophic. The Iron Horse brought soldiers, settlers, and hunters who would systematically destroy the bison herds, shattering the foundation of the Plains Indian culture and forcing them onto reservations. The railroad that bound the nation together tore their world apart. It was a monument to progress, but like all such monuments, it was built on a foundation of sacrifice, exploitation, and the destruction of a world that stood in its path.
The land was ancient, vast, and profoundly indifferent to human ambition.
In the 1890s, the Yukon Territory in northwestern Canada was one of the last truly wild places on the continent, a sprawling wilderness of boreal forest, swift-flowing rivers, and mountains that clawed at a sky that was dark for half the year. Its human population was sparse, consisting of the Trondequitchin First Nation, who had lived in harmony with its harsh rhythms for millennia, and a scattered handful of tough seasoned prospectors and fur traders, men who understood the unforgiving nature of the North. This was a world that measured wealth in warm furs, cured salmon, and the simple fact of survival through another brutal winter. In August of 1896, on a small mosquito-infested creek that fed into the Klondike River, this ancient calculus of survival was shattered. A prospecting party made a discovery that would echo around the world. The group was led by an American prospector named George Carmack, who was traveling with his Tagish wife Kate, her brother Skookum Jim, and their nephew Dawson Charlie. Resting by the creek which they had named Rabbit Creek, Skookum Jim noticed a bright glimmer in the shallows. It was gold, not just a few flakes, but thick, coarse gold lying on the bedrock, easy to pick up with one's fingers. In a single pan of gravel, they found a small fortune. They had stumbled upon one of the richest deposits of placer gold the world had ever seen. News traveled slowly in the north. The initial rush was a local affair, a frenzied but contained scramble as the 100 or so veteran miners already in the Yukon region abandoned their existing claims and staked every available foot of Rabbit Creek, which they quickly renamed Bonanza Creek. They worked through the autumn and the long, dark winter, piling up sacks of gold dust and nuggets, their stunning success a well-kept secret, locked away by the impassable barrier of the frozen landscape. It was not until the summer of 1897, when the Yukon River finally broke free of its ice, that the secret was carried out to the wider world. In mid-July, the steamship Excelsior arrived in San Francisco. A crowd of reporters watched as a line of rough, weather-beaten men in worn clothes began to disembark, struggling under the weight of their luggage. They carried sealskin sacks, old suitcases, and even simple wooden boxes, all of them heavy with gold. A few days later, the steamer Portland docked in Seattle, and the scene was repeated on an even grander scale. The newspapers screamed the headlines in bold type, "Gold, gold, gold." An army of miners had returned from the frozen north, bringing with them, as one paper put it, a ton of gold. The news landed on fertile ground. The United States was in the grip of a deep and prolonged economic depression. The panic of banks had failed, farms had been foreclosed, and millions were unemployed. The story of an accessible mountain of gold, free for the taking in the Great North, was more than a news item. It was a siren song of hope, a potential cure for a nation's economic despair. It ignited a fever, a form of mass hysteria that swept the continent. The Klondike Gold Rush began. It was a stampede of humanity, a chaotic, desperate flood of people heading north. They were not seasoned prospectors. They were clerks from Chicago, farmers from Kansas, doctors and lawyers from New York, men and women from every walk of life who suddenly abandoned their jobs, sold their homes, and cashed in their life savings for a ticket to the Klondike. An estimated 100,000 people set out on the journey. They were called stampters, and the vast majority were completely unprepared for the ordeal that awaited them. Their first stop was a coastal outfitter city like Seattle, which exploded into a frenzy of commerce. Opportunistic merchants sold the would-be miners mountains of gear, much of it useless or absurdly overpriced. They bought special Klondike stoves, Klondike sleeping bags, and all manner of patented mining contraptions that would prove worthless in the field. From there they boarded dangerously overcrowded steamships for the 1,000-mile journey up the coast to the Alaskan Panhandle, to the gateway towns of Skagway and Dye. These towns were the last outposts of civilization, and they were chaotic, muddy, and lawless places, filled with con men, gamblers, and desperate dreamers. It was here, at the foot of the coastal mountain range, that the dream collided with a brutal wall of reality. The Canadian Northwest Mounted Police, in a wise and humane effort to prevent mass starvation in the interior, had established a rule: no one would be allowed to cross into Canadian territory without a year's worth of supplies. This amounted to a literal ton of goods per person: flour, bacon, beans, tools, tents, and winter clothing. This mountain of gear had to be transported over the mountains, a task of Herculean difficulty. There were two main routes: the Chilkoot Pass, starting from Daya, and the White Pass, starting from Skagway. The Chilkoot Trail was shorter but terrifyingly steep. Its final ascent was a section known as the Golden Stair. It was not a staircase of gold but of ice,
a near vertical, 1,500-foot slope of packed snow and ice that the Stampters had to climb. Because a man could only carry a pack of 50 to 60 pounds at a time, the process of moving the required ton of supplies was an agonizing exercise in repetition. A Stampter would haul one pack to the top of the pass, deposit it, and then descend to retrieve the next one. This process had to be repeated 30 to 40 times. For months, the Golden Stairs were a solid moving line of humanity, a single file of men and women hunched under heavy loads, slowly, painfully trudging up the icy slope, each locked in their own private world of exhaustion and misery. It was a human conveyor belt, powered by the sheer force of will. The alternative was the White Pass Trail. It was less steep than the Chilkoot, which attracted those who had brought pack animals, but this route soon earned a more gruesome name, the Dead Horse Trail. The path was narrow, slick with mud, and littered with boulders. The Stampters, desperate and inexperienced, overloaded their animals, driving them mercilessly. The horses, struggling in the deep mud and on the treacherous footing, would slip and fall, breaking their legs, or simply collapse from exhaustion and starvation. The trail became a nightmarish landscape of death. An estimated 3,000 horses perished on the White Path. Their bodies were left to rot where they fell, their carcasses forming a gruesome corduroy road through the mire. The stench of death hung heavy in the air. For those who chose this route, the journey became a grim procession through an equine grave. Conquering the passes was only the first half of the ordeal. On the other side, at the headwaters of the Yukon River, a vast tent city, Lindeman City, sprang up. Here thousands of Stampters, now exhausted from their trek over the mountains, had to build their own boats for the final 500-mile river journey to the goldfields. A frantic, chaotic boat-building frenzy ensued. Using green, unseasoned timber felled from the surrounding hills, the men, most of whom had never built a boat in their lives, constructed thousands of flimsy rafts, scows and crude vessels. When the ice on the lakes broke in the spring of 1898, a great flotilla set off downstream. But the Yukon River was not a gentle highway. It contained stretches of treacherous boiling water, most famously the Miles Canyon and the White Horse Rapids. The turbulent water smashed the poorly made boats against canyon walls and capsized them in the churning wave. Many Stampters saw their entire year's supply of food and equipment, the ton of goods they had so painfully hauled over the passes, sink to the bottom of the icy river in an instant. Some drowned along with their possessions, their dream ending in the freezing water, just short of its destination. Those who survived the river journey finally arrived, in the summer of 1898, at their destination, Dawson City. The town, located at the confluence of the Klondike and Yukon rivers, had exploded from a small trading post into a sprawling, bustling city of 30,000 people. It was a city of log cabins and canvas tents, its muddy streets thronged with miners, gamblers, merchants, and entertainers. But for the vast majority of the Stampters who had just endured a year-long odyssey of unimaginable hardship, a devastating realization awaited them. They were too late. Every profitable claim on Bonanza Creek, El Dorado Creek, and the other gold-rich tributaries had been staked a year earlier by the original, local miners. The ground was already owned. The dream that had propelled them over the mountains and down the river, the dream of picking up nuggets from the creek bed, was an illusion. There was no gold left for them to find. Their only option was to sell their expensive outfits for pennies on the dollar, and work for wages for the very men who owned the rich claims, or to turn around and begin the long, humiliating journey home, empty-handed. Life in Dawson was a paradise for the few who had struck it rich, the Klondike Kings. It was a place of extravagant wealth, where men lit their cigars with $100 bills and drank champagne from dance hall girls' slippers. But for the thousands of disappointed Stampters, it was a place of hardship and disillusionment. Prices for everything were astronomically high. The winters were long, dark, and mind-numbingly cold. Scurvy and other diseases were rampant. It was a city built on gold, but fueled by the broken dreams of the majority. The Great Klondike Gold Rush was as brief as it was intense. By the summer of 1899, just as quickly as it had begun, it was over. News arrived of a new gold strike on the beaches of Nome, Alaska. The fickle tide of humanity turned once again. Dawson City emptied out almost overnight as thousands of men, still chasing the elusive dream, rushed to the next new gold field. The stampede left an indelible mark on the land and its people. It forever changed the Yukon, bringing in a population that cemented Canadian sovereignty over the region. It dispossessed the Trondakweking, whose traditional way of life was disrupted and marginalized, but its most enduring legacy was as a powerful cautionary. The Klondike Gold Rush was never really a story about getting rich. For the tens of thousands who answered its call, it was a story of human endurance against impossible odds. It was a testament to the incredible power of a dream, to drive people to achieve the unimaginable, and a heartbreaking lesson in the brutal, unforgiving reality that often lies at the end of such a dream. It remains a golden echo in the historical imagination, a symbol of the last great adventure of the 19th century.
In the late 18th century, the French colony of Saint-Domingue was the most valuable piece of colonial real estate on the planet. Known as the Pearl of the Antilles, this territory, which occupied the western third of the island of Hispaniola, produced nearly half of all the sugar and coffee consumed in Europe. Its wealth was staggering, a torrent of gold flowing back to the merchants of Bordeaux and Nantes. But this prosperity was built upon a foundation of almost unimaginable human suffering. Saint-Domingue was not merely a colony, it was a vast open-air factory for the production of sugar, and its machinery was composed of the bodies of 500,000 enslaved Africans. Life, if it could be called that, for the enslaved on the sugar plantations, was a short and brutal descent into hell. The work was relentless, back-breaking labor under a punishing tropical sun, from dawn until dusk. The discipline was maintained through a system of institutionalized terror. The Code Noir, or Black Code, which was meant to regulate the treatment of the enslaved, was routinely ignored in favor of the whip, the branding iron, and casual acts of torture that were breathtaking in their cruelty. The mortality rate was so high that the enslaved population could not sustain itself. The entire system depended on a constant, massive importation of new captives from Africa to replace those who were literally worked to death. The society of the colony was a rigid pyramid of race and class. At the top were the Grand Blanc, the wealthy white plantation owners, and high officials. Below them were the Petit Blanc, the poor whites who worked as artisans, shopkeepers, and overseers, filled with resentment for both the grandees above them and the people of color below. And then there was a third group, the gens de couleur libre, the free people of color. Many were the children of white planters and enslaved women. Some were wealthy and owned plantations and slaves of their own, yet they were still subject to humiliating racial laws that denied them the full rights of citizens. At the bottom of this volatile pyramid, vastly outnumbering all the others combined, was the enslaved population, a powder keg of humanity, waiting for a spark. In 1789, that spark was ignited thousands of miles away, in the streets of Paris. The French Revolution erupted, and its ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity washed across the Atlantic like a tidal wave. In Saint-Domingue, each social group heard these words and interpreted them for their own ends. The Grand Blanc saw an opportunity for greater colonial autonomy and freedom from French taxes. The Petit Blanc saw a chance to gain equality with the wealthy planters. The free people of color saw the promise of full citizenship and an end to racial discrimination. And the enslaved, in their quarters and in the fields, heard the whispers of liberty and began to believe that this new age of man might also apply to them. The infighting between the white factions and the armed struggle of the free people of color destabilized the colony, shattering the illusion of control and creating a vacuum of power. On the night of August 24, in a secluded forest known as Bois Cayman, a Vodou ceremony took place. In the midst of a raging tropical storm, a priestess sacrificed a black pig, and the assembled leaders of various slave groups drank its blood, swearing an oath to fight for their freedom. A week later, the northern plain of Saint-Domingue erupted in fire. Tens of thousands of enslaved people rose up in a coordinated revolt. They moved from plantation to plantation, killing the owners and their families, and setting the cane fields ablaze. The night sky glowed red with the fires of their vengeance. Decades of repressed rage and suffering were unleashed in a wave of brutal violence. The Haitian Revolution had begun. Into this chaos stepped a man who would become one of the most remarkable figures of his age. His name was Potosi. He was a man approaching 50 years old, a generation older than most of the rebels. He had been born into slavery on a plantation, but had been fortunate. His master had recognized his intelligence, allowed him to learn to read and write, and had eventually freed him. Toussaint had worked as a coachman, and was a skilled herbalist and veterinarian. He was a devout Catholic, but was also deeply knowledgeable about African traditions and Vodou. He was a quiet, thoughtful man, not a fiery revolutionary. Initially, Toussaint was hesitant to join the revolt, but as it grew, he sent his own family to safety and then joined the burgeoning rebel army, first serving as a doctor. His talents, however, were far greater than healing wounds. He possessed a natural genius for military strategy and political organization. In the chaotic landscape of competing rebel factions, Toussaint's intelligence and discipline quickly set him apart. He began to train a small group of followers, instilling in them the discipline of a European army. He understood that rage alone could not win a war. Victory required order, strategy, and a clear political vision. The political situation was a maelstrom. The French Republicans were fighting the French Royalists. The Spanish, who controlled the eastern side of the island, saw an opportunity to destabilize their French rivals and began to support the slave rebellion, offering them arms and supplies. Toussaint, a pragmatist, made a strategic decision. He joined the Spanish army, accepting a commission as an officer. For the Spanish, he was a useful pawn. For Toussaint, they were a source of training, weapons, and legitimacy for his growing army. He rose through their ranks, proving himself to be a brilliant commander, winning battle after battle against the French. Then in 1794, the revolution took another dramatic turn. The radical Jacobin government in Paris, facing invasions from both Spain and Great Britain, made a desperate and radical calculation to win the allegiance of the black population of Saint-Domingue and turn them against their European rivals. The National Convention declared the abolition of slavery in all French colonies. It was one of the most progressive acts of the age. When news of the decree reached Saint-Domingue, Toussaint was faced with a momentous choice. He had been fighting for the Spanish monarchy, which still upheld slavery. Now the French Republic, his former enemy, was offering universal freedom. Toussaint, whose ultimate goal had always been the definitive emancipation of his people, made a swift and decisive pivot. He abandoned his Spanish allies, turned his disciplined army around, and rejoined the French. He attacked his former Spanish commanders, drove them out of their strongholds, and in a matter of months, had cleared them from the colony. He was now a French general, the commander of the most effective fighting force on the island. His next task was to confront the British, who had invaded the colony, hoping to seize its riches for themselves. The British army, one of the most powerful in the world, was decimated not just by Toussaint's brilliant guerrilla tactics, but by an even deadlier enemy, yellow fever. After 5 years of brutal warfare and losing thousands of men to battle and disease, the British were forced to withdraw in defeat. By 1798, Toussaint, the former slave, was the undisputed master of Saint-Domingue. The French appointed him governor-general, but his authority was absolute. He ruled the colony as a de facto, autonomous state. He faced the immense challenge of rebuilding a land that had been shattered by nearly a decade of continuous warfare. The economy was in ruins, the plantations destroyed. To generate revenue and provide for his people, Toussaint knew he had to restart the agricultural economy. He made a controversial and difficult decision. He implemented a system of forced labor, ordering the formerly enslaved population back to the plantation. They were no longer slaves, they were to be paid a share of the proceeds and could not be bought or sold, but they were not free to leave. It was a harsh, militarized system, and it made him unpopular with many of the very people he had fought to liberate. But Toussaint believed it was a necessary discipline to prevent the colony from collapsing into starvation and chaos. In 1801, he took his boldest step yet. He promulgated a new constitution for Saint-Domingue. It was a document that formally abolished slavery forever and declared that all men, regardless of color, were equal citizens. It also made Toussaint governor-general for life, with the power to choose his own successor. He had created a constitution for a French colony without consulting France. He sent an envoy to Paris to present the constitution to the man who was now the ruler of France, Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon, the first consul, was a man who did not tolerate rivals. He saw Toussaint's constitution as an act of insolence, a declaration of independence in all but name. Furthermore, Napoleon had a grand vision for a new French empire in the Americas, centered on the Louisiana Territory. The economic engine for this empire was to be a restored and profitable Saint-Domingue. And in Napoleon's mind, profitability meant one thing: the restoration of slavery. Toussaint and his army of free black citizens were an obstacle to this vision. Napoleon made a fateful decision. He would destroy Toussaint and re-enslave the people of Saint-Domingue. In early 1802, the largest expeditionary force ever to leave France set sail for the Caribbean. It was a fleet of warships carrying over 20,000 veteran soldiers, commanded by Napoleon's own brother-in-law, General Charles Leclerc. Leclerc's public orders were to secure the colony for France. His secret orders from Napoleon were to arrest Toussaint, deport him and his generals to France, and then, once all resistance was crushed, to officially re-establish slavery. When the massive French fleet appeared off the coast, Toussaint knew a great struggle was at hand. He told his people, "We are going to fight a war of annihilation." He led a brilliant and brutal defense, employing a scorched earth policy. As the French advanced, Toussaint's armies burned the coastal cities to the ground, destroyed the plantations, and retreated into the mountainous interior to wage a guerrilla war. But the French forces, with their superior numbers and weaponry, were relentless. One by one, Toussaint's key generals, including Jean-Jacques Dessalines and Henri Christophe, seeing the overwhelming force against them, surrendered to the French, in exchange for promises that their ranks would be maintained and that slavery would not be restored. Toussaint, his army dwindling, finally agreed to retire.
Leclerc gave him a solemn promise that he could live out his days in peace on his farm. It was a deliberate deception. A few weeks later, Toussaint was tricked into a meeting, seized by French soldiers, bound and thrown onto a warship. As the ship pulled away from the island he had fought so hard to free, he spoke his last, prophetic words to his captors. In overthrowing me, he said, "You have done no more than cut down the trunk of the tree of black liberty in Saint-Domingue. It will spring back from the roots, for they are numerous and deep." He was transported to France and imprisoned in the Fort de Joux, a cold, damp fortress high in the Jura Mountains, near the Swiss border. He was held in solitary confinement in a stone dungeon, deprived of adequate food, warmth, and medical care. Napoleon wanted him to die quietly, to disappear from history. After months of suffering, Toussaint Louverture, the liberator of Saint-Domingue, died of pneumonia and malnutrition in his cell in April of 18. But Napoleon's victory was a hollow one. The French soon learned that Toussaint's prophecy was true. As word spread that Napoleon intended to restore slavery, and as the yellow fever season began to tear through the non-immune French army, Toussaint's generals, Dessalines and Christophe, realized they had been betrayed. They rose up once more, reigniting the war with a new, even more ferocious intensity. Leclerc himself succumbed to yellow fever, and the French army, decimated by disease and relentless guerrilla attacks, collapsed. On January 1, 1804, Dessalines declared the independent nation of Haiti, the Arawak name for the island. The revolution was complete. The tree of liberty had sprung back from its roots, watered by the blood of its founder. It was the world's first black republic, a nation born from the only successful slave revolt in human history, a stunning and enduring legacy of the man they called the Black Spartacus.
The age of exploration was often the domain of aristocrats and gentlemen of means, men whose birth afforded them the captaincy of great ships and royal commissions. But the man who would unlock the final secrets of the great Pacific Ocean, who would map more of the globe than any other in history, was not born to such a world. James Cook was the son of a Scottish farm laborer, born in a humble cottage in Yorkshire. His destiny seemed to be the soil, but his gaze was always drawn to the sea. He began his career not in the gilded officer class of the Royal Navy but on the grimy, hard-working decks of coal-carrying ships in the rough waters of the North Sea. It was here, in this demanding and unglamorous environment, that he learned the true art of seamanship and, more importantly, the precise science of navigation and cartography. He was a quiet, serious, and immensely capable young man. When he eventually joined the Royal Navy, his prodigious talent could not be ignored. During the 7 Years' War against France in North America, it was Cook's astonishingly accurate and detailed charts of the treacherous St. Lawrence River that allowed the British fleet to navigate its rapids and shallows, a crucial factor in the successful capture of Quebec. He was a man who earned his reputation not through patronage but through sheer undeniable competence. He was a master of his craft. In 1768, the Royal Society of London and the British Admiralty were planning an expedition of great scientific importance. The planet Venus was due to make a rare transit across the face of the Sun, an event that, if observed from multiple points on the globe, could allow astronomers to calculate the size of the solar system with unprecedented accuracy. The ideal viewing location was the recently discovered island of Tahiti in the South Pacific. For this delicate and prestigious mission, they needed a commander who was not just a naval officer, but also a superb astronomer and navigator. They chose James Cook. He was given command of a sturdy, flat-bottomed vessel, a former coal carrier much like the ones he had learned on, renamed HMS Endeavour. The ship was packed with scientific instruments, and accompanying Cook was a party of scientists, led by the wealthy, charismatic young botanist Joseph Banks, and the Swedish naturalist Daniel Solander. Their official mission was to observe the transit of Venus, but Cook carried secret orders, to be opened only after the astronomical task was complete. He was to sail south from Tahiti, into the vast empty quarter of the Pacific in search of the great mythical southern continent, the land known as Terra Australis Incognita. For centuries, geographers had believed a massive land mass must exist in the south to balance the continents of the northern hemisphere. Cook's mission was to find it. The voyage to Tahiti was long, but Cook ran a disciplined and remarkably healthy ship. He was obsessed with conquering the scourge of long sea voyages, scurvy. He insisted on a clean ship and forced his men to consume unfamiliar foods like sauerkraut and malt, believing they held anti-scorbutic properties. After successfully observing the transit of Venus from a fortified observatory they named Fort Venus, Cook opened his secret orders and sailed south into the unknown. He found no continent. Instead, after weeks at sea, he sighted the coast of New Zealand. Though it had been briefly visited by the Dutch explorer Abel Tasman over a century earlier, it remained a mysterious coastline on the map. Cook would change that. Over the next 6 months, he methodically and painstakingly circumnavigated both the North and South Islands, proving they were not the northern shore of a great continent. His charts were a marvel of precision, so accurate that they were still in use over a century later. His encounters with the native Maori people were complex and often fraught with misunderstanding and violence. Cook, though more enlightened than many of his contemporaries, struggled to bridge the cultural chasm, and these first contacts were often tense and bloody, a pattern that would repeat throughout his voyages. From New Zealand he sailed west, and in April 1770, he sighted the east coast of a vast new land. He had reached what we now call Australia. He sailed north along this unknown coastline, charting its features with his usual meticulous. He and the scientist, particularly Joseph Banks, were astonished by the unique flora and fauna, so different from anything they had ever seen. They landed at a wide, sheltered bay, which, due to the immense number of new plant species collected there, Banks named Botany. The journey north became a fight for survival when, one night, the Endeavour struck a reef with a sickening crunch. The ship was impaled on the coral of the Great Barrier Reef, miles from shore. Water poured in through the gash in its hull. For 23 terrifying hours the crew worked with a desperate, disciplined energy. They jettisoned cannons, barrels and ballast to lighten the ship, while manning the pumps continuously. They fathered the hull, sewing a sail with oakum and wool, and hauling it under the ship to partially plug the hole. Their efforts, guided by Cook's calm and expert command, saved the ship from certain destruction. After weeks of repairs on a remote riverbank, they resumed their journey, eventually rounding the Cape of Good Hope, and sailing home. They arrived in England in 1771, having been away for 3 years. Cook had not found the southern continent, but he had redrawn the map of the world. He was hailed as a hero, but the question of Terra Australis still lingered. The Admiralty, determined to settle the matter once and for all, immediately began planning a second voyage, and there was only one man to lead it. This time Cook was given 2 ships, the Resolution and the Adventure. His mission was simple and audacious: to sail as far south as a ship could possibly go, to prove or disprove the existence of the southern continent beyond any doubt. What followed was one of the greatest feats of navigation and endurance in human history. From 1772 to 1775, Cook used the Southern Ocean as his personal laboratory. He repeatedly plunged south into the frigid, fog-bound waters of the Antarctic. He became the first man to cross the Antarctic Circle, a line no sailor had ever passed before. He and his crew witnessed sights that no human had ever seen: towering icebergs of an impossible blue, vast fields of pack ice that stretched to the horizon, and the strange, ethereal glow of the southern light. The conditions were brutal. The psychological toll of sailing for weeks without seeing anything but ice and gray water, immense. He never saw the continent of Antarctica itself, but his voyages proved that if a southern landmass existed, it was a frozen, uninhabitable wasteland, not the temperate paradise of legend. He had, as he put it, put an end to all searching after a southern continent. This second voyage was also a triumph of science and leadership. On a journey of over 70,000 miles, much of it in the most hostile environment on Earth, Cook lost only a handful of men to sickness, and not a single one to scurvy. He had conquered the sailor's greatest plague. During the warmer seasons, he crisscrossed the Pacific, revisiting New Zealand and Tahiti, and making first European contact with numerous other islands, including Easter Island with its mysterious giant statues, and the islands of Tonga and New Caledonia. He returned to England in 1775, his fame and reputation now legendary. He had erased a phantom from the map and replaced it with scientific certainty. He was ready for a quiet retirement, a comfortable desk job at the Admiralty. But there was one last great mystery of the seas to be solved, one last phantom to be chased: the Northwest Passage. The dream of a navigable sea route over the top of North America, linking the Atlantic and Pacific, still captivated the British government. They asked Cook to lead one final expedition, this time to search for the passage not from the Atlantic side, but from the Pacific. Weary but unable to resist the call of the unknown, Cook agreed. In 1776 he set sail on his third and final voyage, once again in his trusted ship, the Resolution. He sailed north along the Pacific coast of North America, from modern-day Oregon,
past Vancouver Island, and up to the coast of Alaska. Charting this vast and complex coastline for the first time, he pushed north through the Bering Strait, into the Arctic Ocean, until his path was finally blocked by a solid, impenetrable wall of ice. The Northwest Passage, he concluded, was not a practical reality. On his way north in early 1778, he had made another momentous discovery. He had stumbled upon a group of high volcanic islands in the central Pacific, islands whose existence was completely unknown to the outside world. He named them the Sandwich Islands, in honor of his patron, the Earl of Sandwich. Today we know them as the Hawaiian Islands. The first encounter with the people of Hawaii was peaceful and awe-inspiring. Cook and his men were greeted as honored guests, perhaps even as gods. The Hawaiians were fascinated by their great ships and their strange technologies. Cook spent time on the islands, trading and documenting the culture, before sailing north for his attempt on the Arctic. After being repelled by the ice, he decided to return to the Sandwich Islands to rest his crew and wait out the winter. He chose a large, sheltered bay on the main island of Hawaii, a bay named Kealakekua. This time the atmosphere was different. The long stay of the British ships began to strain the resources and the patience of the islander. The initial reverence for the strange visitors began to curdle into resentment. Tensions grew over trade and the behavior of the sailors. After finally leaving the bay, the Resolution suffered a broken mast in a storm, forcing Cook to make the fateful decision to return to Kealakekua for repairs. Their reappearance was not welcomed. It seemed to the Hawaiians that these strange visitors would never leave. The relationship deteriorated rapidly. A series of thefts occurred. Finally, one of the ship's cutters, a small but essential boat, was stolen by the islander. Cook, enraged, decided on a tactic that had worked for him on other islands. He would go ashore and take the Hawaiian king, Kalaniʻōpuʻu, hostage, holding him on the ship until the boat was returned. On the morning of February 14, 1779, Cook went ashore with a small detachment of Marines. He entered the king's village, and persuaded the elderly ruler to accompany him. But as they walked towards the beach, a large and agitated crowd of Hawaiian warriors gathered, alarmed at the sight of their king being led away. A tense standoff ensued, a misunderstanding, a shot fired, and the situation exploded into violence. Cook and his men were overwhelmed by the crowd. The great navigator, the man who had faced down Antarctic ice and Pacific storms, was struck from behind and stabbed to death on the rocky shoreline. The news of his death was met with shock and disbelief in Europe. Captain James Cook, the man who seemed invincible, was gone. His legacy remains as vast and complex as the ocean he charted. He was a brilliant, humane and disciplined commander, who filled in the last great blanks on the map of the world. He was a scientist who conquered scurvy, and a cartographer, whose work was the gold standard for a century. But he was also, unintentionally, the vanguard of an empire. In his wake came traders, missionaries and colonizers. The new worlds he opened to European eyes were soon ravaged by European diseases, and dispossessed by European power. He was a man of the Enlightenment, a bringer of knowledge. But the knowledge he brought cast a long and often dark shadow over the peoples and islands he so meticulously put on the map.